Lately, I think it's pretty clear that I've been into a lot of games that are at least tangentially similar to Namco's Genpei Tomaden. Despite the issues I displayed in my review of that arcade title on this channel, I still consider it to be an interesting departure from what other games were doing at the time. It's an ambitious thing for a 1986 joint, and the darker tone really appeals to me. Last time on this channel, we took a look at Getsu Fumaden, a pretty perfect Konami action-adventure released a year later in 1987, and one that I hope more people get the opportunity to play. I consider it to be a fairly flawless game overall, but I'm not going to bore you by retreading that. The review is up. It's on this channel for those of you who are interested. Today, it's all about Kenseiden, and I've got to admit, this one's a bit of a stretch if we're talking games that are similar to those other two. There's an overworld map, side-scrolling action platformer sequences, and a sword-wielding samurai. Aside from those similarities, this is really its own thing. Kenseiden was developed and published by Sega back in 1988. In it, you'll take control of Hayato, a samurai who is tasked with retrieving 5 scrolls from 16 action stages, all set in 16th century Japan. That is, unless you're playing the South Korean version where the main man has been altered to look like a Korean warrior, with an altered map to look like Korea. How many more times can I say Korea? Once more, for good measure, Korea. There are some differences between the Western version of this game and the original Japanese one. Throughout this review, I'll be alternating between the two. The Japanese version was released first, and it's the one I own due to it being the less expensive cart. It's a pretty important point to address right here at the top, as this version features a blonde Hayato, and the majority of the colors are less dark overall. It's also completely in Japanese, if you can imagine that. In the Western alternative, the protagonist's hair is black, and a lot of the palette follows suit. You would think it would be the opposite, but I guess not. Unfortunately, I don't own this version, so the footage you're seeing is from an emulator. Personally, I think the colors pop a bit more in the Western game, and well, it's also kind of nice to be able to read what's happening in perfect English. Sword. Aside from these graphical and textual differences, these games play the exact same as far as I can tell. Canst you believe it? I can't. Kenseiden is pretty tough according to a lot of people, but I think it plays fair most of the time. Now, I don't want to sound like one of those elitist gamer types, but I didn't find this thing all that hard. Yes, it can be tricky to get the feel of it down. You see, Hayato moves quite slow, and the action requires a certain degree of patience, but no more than, say, the Castlevania titles on the NES. I mean, if you're expecting to throw caution to the wind and blast through this thing like a fast-paced action platformer, you're gonna have a tough time. Hayato might not be in a hurry, but his measured movements are made up for with his breadth of abilities. At the start, you'll be weak with a pretty standard sword attack, but it won't take long until you've acquired new skills, and the difficulty curve is quite manageable. Normally, I wouldn't call people out because I rarely read other reviews, but while looking up a particular code, I stumbled on some pretty common opinions that this thing is flawed due to its difficulty. Now look, I don't want to sound too harsh because people have their own reasons and experiences, but those reviews are just flat out wrong, yeah. Okay. I'm on a soapbox right now. But have those other folks even played an 8-bit game? My advice, ignore them and listen to me. Kenseiden is tough, but it's not insurmountably challenging, and it certainly doesn't ruin the experience. That's an objective fact. Take that to the bank. That being said, it did take me quite a few attempts to get past the first stage without hemorrhaging all of my life. This initial level is almost a tutorial. It showcases the types of enemies you'll be pitted up against throughout the rest of the game. There are tiny, spastic ones that dart around the screen, and slower, stronger ones that require multiple hits to take down. It will likely take a few attempts to reliably see the end of this stage with most of your health intact, but once you've mastered how all of this works, it's pretty much smooth sailing until the very end. Occasionally, you'll be faced with other challenges, but by and large, there are small, quick baddies that can be eliminated with one hit, and larger ones that require a bit more patience. Rinse and repeat. That's not to imply that the game gets boring or repetitive though, because it really doesn't. The stages vary in length, and there are a bunch of different types of enemy patterns to learn, right up until the very end. After the first level, you'll be spat out to a map screen where the game guides you towards the next objective. What follows is a larger action sequence with some branching pathways, hidden rooms, and a wheel skeleton prototype that proves that Kenseiden was the Dark Souls of 8-bit Sega games. It just wouldn't be a proper review if we didn't compare everything to the Dark Souls series, so here are a few other visual examples. Once you defeat Wheel Skeleton 1.0, you'll be able to unlock a door which now acts as a permanent shortcut throughout this particular stage, just in case you want to revisit this section later. Now, I'm not going to be walking through this thing beat for beat, but this is where the game starts to open up, with multiple provinces to choose from on the map. I think it sets the stage pretty well, while gradually easing you into the gameplay. Most of the selectable levels are worth visiting, but only a fraction of them are mandatory. In them you'll find extra lives, permanent strength buffs, and other useful items, such as this nuclear grenade-looking thing that acts as a health regenerator when you lose all of it. These things are very helpful and can be found tucked away in a large percentage of the Japanese provinces, or South Korean provinces. They'll also reappear each time you revisit these worlds from the map screen, so if you're having a tough time, it's well worth it to return to these areas for some assured insurance. There are no continues per se, but you can find diaries in well-hidden areas that enable you to restart, though these are mostly useless, since your weapons and power-ups get reset, so it's best just to start over. If you're not a stickler when it comes to playing fair, there is a code that you can input on the game over screen that works similarly to the one present in the original Super Mario Bros. Title. It's easy to pull off and allows you to continue where you left off with all of your goodies intact. Honestly though, this isn't a particularly long game and one-ups are fairly generous, so I never felt the need to use it. Extra lives can be found in the shape of Fisher-Price Little People and by accumulating enough points. Scattered across the maps, you'll also find 3 different training grounds that toss you through some really tricky gauntlets in order to obtain permanent health and power upgrades. These are completely optional, but well worth the time for the reasons I just explained. They're also very tough and require a lot of pattern memorization, since you can only be hit once before you're sent back to the start. The good thing is that each inevitable failure only removes a tiny fraction of health each time, and resources do drop to refill it occasionally. But this sort of rote memorization isn't my thing, so I don't always complete these rooms every time I play. Though, I definitely recommend putting in the time and effort, as I always regret not finishing them when I'm on the final stretch. This guy is the toughest boss in the entire game that you'll never get to fight. He's a sadistic, lonely man that could learn a thing or two from Mr. Miyagi, a torturous criminal who deceptively claims to be your ally as he watches you fail over and over in his large bamboo murder constructs. Now that's some deep Kenseiden lore for all of you out there. You're welcome. When it comes to item drops out in the wild, they are few and far between. Enemies rarely drop bouquets of uneven testicle parcels to replenish your life. Oh, wait, okay. Oh, this just in. These are gourds. Gourds of life. And okay. These are medicine cases, not nuclear grenades. Either way, the uneven testicle parcels drop infrequently, so you'll have to rely on your skills and, as a last-ditch effort, your nuclear grenades. It's really hard to say nuclear. Speaking of skills, Hayato's got 'em. It's remarkable how many moves he can acquire from defeating bosses and collecting scrolls. There's a high jump, an upward slash, and a berserker mode that's a real blast to use in the later regions. They are all easy to pull off as the controls are very responsive despite the limited 2-button layout of the Master System pad. By the end, you'll need to use most of your abilities in tandem, as enemies come at you from all different directions. It's rewarding to feel your character grow throughout the adventure, and satisfying to know you can travel down your own route to reach the final boss. There is one power-up that is mandatory, but for the most part you can play the game the way you like, and that's the thing I find so compelling about the structure of the map. It enables you to switch up the pace and the challenge in subsequent playthroughs organically, without a tacky main screen difficulty option. Another thing that keeps me coming back for more are the beautiful backgrounds and well-detailed sprites. Everything is illustrated very well with characters that look great in motion. There's a lot of shading on the relatively large protagonist and the even bigger baddies. Unlike a lot of its contemporaries, Kenseiden opted for a more realistic horror style, which suits the story well. The overall presentation is quite dark, and most of the enemies fit into the bleak world. A lot of games on the hardware took advantage of the color palette with bright, cartoony visuals, but Kenseiden showcases the Master System's spectrum in a subtler way. It's still vibrant and lush, but the muted tones really add another level to the overall atmosphere. It rarely gets boring to look at. Statues, flora, and intricate texture designs are well drawn and really pop off the screen without taking too much attention from the animated sprites, which are the real stars of the show here. Unfortunately, I can't really be so positive about the music, which ranges from incredibly punchy to tinny and flaccid, depending on the hardware. Alright, so the Sega Master System was able to simultaneously make use of the FM chip and PSG. However, the Mark IIIs couldn't achieve both, meaning composers were often forced to make two separate soundtracks. If you've played this game before, it's very likely that you have heard the PSG music. Now, I do think that my preference for one over the other largely boils down to the game, but here in Kenseiden, the FM tracks, they sound monumentally better. Yes, this is even more subjective than my review itself, but the PSG is just too tinny for me, and honestly makes my brain hurt after a few dozen seconds here. I'll let you be the judge. FM music is earthy with a satisfying bass sound in my ears. There's a discernible separation between the audio tracks that works for me, while the alternative just gives me a headache. To be fair, the harmonies are still present, and the arrangements are well conceived, but all of it sounds muddled and tinny. From my understanding, the majority of the system's 9 channels are practically static. as in, a musician couldn't alter them. The way it was explained to me back in the day was to think of a cheap keyboard with built-in key sounds. If the writer can't adjust the majority of them, then they have to work around the limitations, which ultimately results in the composer not having their own voice. This is a pretty common sound for a lot of Master System games, which is a real shame since the FM chip was available, just not as common in certain regions. Returning to Kenseiden and getting to the bottom line, I think this is a superb soundtrack marred by the inconsistencies of the Sega hardware. Normally, I'm one of the only people out there to credit a game's composer, or composers, plural, but sadly, I couldn't find any information on this musician, and trust me, I tried. Hey look, it's a wheel skeleton from Dark Souls. And a Segway. All of the bosses in Kenseiden are large and as detailed as everything else in the game. They have predictable yet satisfying patterns to learn and are well designed all around. This big lad feels particularly inspired by Genpei Tomaden and has a very specific, strange weakness. You need to attack him while his left knee is protruding towards you. These are little touches that I really enjoy. Also, check out this disgusting thing dumping larvae out of whatever it's called. The animations are gross, but oh so nifty. Oh, and while we're on the topic of disgusting, unpleasant abominations, let's play Where's Alex Kidd? You can all join together. Do you see him? Oh, the time is ticking. Truly ghastly. Congratulations, you found him. Skull Boss. Kenseiden is a pretty phenomenal game. It's brief, so I don't know if it warrants the high prices for a Western copy, but it has swords, so it probably deserves all of your money. On a serious note, I don't like to talk about other people's opinions, and I rarely look at other reviews, but if you have been turned off by this thing because you've read that it is too difficult, you're missing out. I know the differences between objective and subjective, but I've gotta say, if these folks had actually played this thing, they would have overcome that very initial challenge hurdle. All games take a few moments to adjust to, and I can legitimately say that Kenseiden isn't insurmountably tough or unfair. You might just not like it, which is fine. If you don't like it, I'm not personally hurt or offended by that. I'm just not a big fan of people spouting complete and utter nonsense. Canst thou agree? Thou art but a novice. Sword. Next time I'll be covering the sequel to Genpei Tomaden for the PC Engine. I think I gave a pretty fair opinion of the arcade original by highlighting some of the good things as well as spanking it for its naughtiness. Here's hoping that the console exclusive follow-up is a bit more consistent with less annoying bits. Kenseiden, the darkest of the souls.